Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, based on your time, John. Welcome in Salesforce Epics Hour. Today, we are going to talk about the governance process in Salesforce, and we have two great speakers with us, Lilith and Christopher. So, let me hand over them for their introduction and the presentation. Hand over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amit. We're really excited to be doing this session again. So we did it at Dreamforce, but we found it such a shame that it wasn't recorded, especially because we got such good feedback and attendance. So that's when we bumped into you and we asked you, hey, maybe we can do it again for Apex Hours. And you gave us that awesome opportunity. So thank you so much for having us and for everyone who's joining in or watching later. We really love this topic. So it's really nice that we get to do it again. We're gonna talk a bit about what it means to, set up governance. What is the approach to governance from an architecture point of view? We'll tackle some well-architected elements. We'll tackle some practical things that really get you going. That's our goal. But before we do, I'm not gonna read this one because that was one from the Dreamforce, and we're really not trying to sell you anything. So I'm just gonna jump to who we are. Chris, you want to get started first?
Oh, thanks again. Christopher is my name. I'm the Salesforce CTO for Capgemini in Germany, and I'm dealing there with a lot of enterprise customers, and we have to face there a lot of governance issues, and that's why I'm so keen as Lilith to that kind of topic, and I'm really looking forward to present the topic again, and it's a kind of like, okay, the second retry or rerun of the session from the Dreamforce. So I'm really looking forward to share some insights with you.
Yeah, and I'm Lilith van Biese. I'm a Salesforce Principal Architect and a CTA at Capgemini. And yeah, my pronouns are she, her. I really love the session that we did in Dreamforce. I'm super happy to just jump in and go at it again. So I won't linger on for too much and we'll just get to the content, which I'm sure you'll like. So first of all, we want to talk a bit about intentional, because if we look at governance, we look at well-architected, it's all part of the intentional pillar within. But what is intentional? So intentional means that you have an architecture that is easier to own, to maintain, and it can evolve with business more easily. It follows clear and consistent implementation patterns, and we'll talk about what that means, how you can set those up in just a minute. But basically, this means that for builders, it's easier to interpret and implement these new features or the design for those features, because again, we have the consistency, we have the patterns, we have the best practices, we have the guidelines. And then for the maintenance teams, it's also a lot easier to understand the documentation of what's been implemented. For one, because there is documentation, which isn't always a given. So that's what we mean with intentional. And I will try to keep the dumb jokes to a minimum, but we make no promises. That's our forward-looking state word. Right, Christopher?
Let's give it a try. Okay. So for those who are in the chat and potentially want to get a little bit familiar with the term intentional, do you think this is kind of intentional? So a kind of intentional architecture? So just potentially drop it into the chat if you think yes, no, your thoughts. Okay, I see a yes, that's good. There's a no as well.
Oh, that's good. Some controversy.
That's good. That's exactly what we thought about in terms of intentional, or what is the key essence about it. It's like not having something which is like simple in one way. It's really that is serving what is actually the purpose and where it's designed for. So think about those kind of aircraft pilots actually here, who fly us around the world, and potentially for them it's a super intentional architecture, because everything is in the right place. You have everything on the screen, everything in control, and based on the statistic, it seems to be pretty promising. So if we're moving further, we can think about another example. So for those who are actually older, like me, they are knowing the movie Back to the Future, and they potentially know Dog as well, and the time traveling machine you're seeing in the background. So what do you think is your thought about it? Is this a well architected or a kind of an intentional architecture? And again, I'm looking into the chat. Okay.
This is a tough one, it seems.
This is a tough one, right, Lilith? I mean, we both talked about quite for a long time, but if you're thinking back to the movies and potentially you need to know the movie actually, then you will figure out that the testing was potentially not really planned properly. That there was also maybe some lacks in terms of the documentations. So it's maybe not what we think about is the real like kind of an intentional architecture. And to give it some background and even more consistency, maybe Lilith, you can add some points to that as well.
Yeah, indeed. So let's talk a bit about, okay, we gave you some examples, but how, if we look at well architecture or well architected, what is an intentional strategy? So we look at, on the one hand, the prioritization, which means that your work has to be detailed to a certain level, right? We need to know what is the business impact. We need to know what is the scope or the amount of work that we will have with this. And this doesn't only go for implementation. We need to really think about the total cost of ownership, which includes the maintenance. So how is this going to be effort-wise and cost-wise, because maybe the total cost of ownership doesn't increase because of maintenance effort, but because of additional license cost. So all of these things we need to keep in mind. And then once we have a bit of a view, we need to see, okay, but what is, for this particular work item, let's call it, what is its position or its order in the full roadmap that we have in mind? Again, looking at the prioritization. So we already talked, or we hinted at the roadmap. The roadmap is really what's to be done. It's used to make sure that we are aligning the stakeholders, for one, on the why, and we make sure that everyone has a consistent understanding of where we are going. And I think if you look at governance, that's half of what we're trying to do, is making sure that we have all the stakeholders aligned. And how are we doing that? Well, in governance, as we see, we have a certain structure that we use to formalize this alignment, to formalize the collaboration. This can take the shape, and usually does, of roles and responsibilities, of processes and cadences. And that is, in a nutshell, what is intentional. And we are, of course, going to focus on governance. But if you want to know more, we included a QR code to the well-architected resource, so definitely feel free to check that out. But before we go into too much theory, I think we need to put it in practice.
Thanks. So as mentioned before, we both facing those kind of governance issues or issues related to governance quite often. So if we're moving forward, I guess we can share with you some kind of examples. So first, and I really like to look at governance in terms of like, what are the kind of anti-patterns? So first, and that's all kind of, those three examples are all from real life experiences. So first of all, there's a catalog. So I call it a catalog shopping. So really kind of isolated Salesforce implementations without a benefit. So what does it mean? For one of our customers, we had the challenge that they started with a dedicated Service Cloud implementation, and later on, they created a new Salesforce instance for their Sales Cloud. And after a while, they figured out, hey, okay, we can't really do without any kind of bigger effort, do joint use cases. So in terms of like upselling, cross-selling out of service and vice versa, if you're having some kind of issues in terms of the sales process. So what they just did is picking out of the Salesforce catalog certain items, but without really thinking how they really can utilize it in a kind of an end-to-end process. The second one is actually one of my favorites. It's the kind of the unicorn solution. And I guess all of us know that from their own experience. If you spend a lot of effort on a solution without any kind of business value. So in the worst case, you spend potentially 80% of the kind of development effort, and then later on you figure out that the feature was potentially just used once or twice. So always joking around, it's like the solution for the 29th of February when it falls together with a kind of a new moon, so kind of a very less likelihood. And that are the kind of typical things we always kind of encounter within our projects as well. And last but not least, obviously, the Groundhog Day. So it's something I encountered just a couple of weeks ago now, where there was no real decision-making process in place. So how was that kind of reality? So there was an issue in terms of like which kind of integration pattern should be picked in terms of how to connect two systems, or a system to Salesforce, actually a remote system. And we had a meeting. And in the meeting, we started and explained, yeah, okay, this is the issue, and that's the kind of data we want to push around, and that are potentially some obstacles down the road. And then within the meeting, we realized, okay, they are not all stakeholders involved. We need to add another person. So on the next day, we had the same meeting again. The person was then available. So we started again from the beginning. Okay, this is like the use case. This is our business case. This is what we want to do. And then the person said, yeah, but we need another person, which can actually help. There we need another person. So 2 days after, again, we had the same meeting. We started from the beginning, explained, you know what I mean, and hopefully you get it. In that particular case, it turned out that we had a meeting kind of 13, 14 times, and it was really like a Groundhog Day, where we didn't really found like a conclusion. And I come to that, how we overcome those kind of situations with that customer in particular. But it's exactly what Lille mentioned before in terms of finding or having the right stakeholders in place is one of the key elements of governance.
Yeah, and the last one, especially the example that you gave, Christopher, it kind of feels like a reverse musical chair. Instead of, chairs being removed, there's every meeting you're adding more people, but usually it doesn't really yield any decisions, right? It becomes kind of a herd that's all looking at each other, right? Who's going to be the first one to, gamble or say yes or no or whatever, and it's usually not more productive just because there's more people.
Indeed.
And before we jump into how you solve some of these things, I really think we'll look at some of the awesome tendencies, let's say, in the ecosystem. I think the unicorn solution is so typical for Salesforce, because every release we have kind of all these new awesome things being thrown at us, and we really, really, really would love to play with them and implement them. So sometimes, and I know I've definitely been guilty of this, you kind of see if you can find an excuse to kind of go for this and implement this. I've done it in the past, and it was purely my unicorn solution. I just really would have wanted to play around with custom metadata types when it first came out. It was so not suited for what we needed to do, but yeah. It was my unicorn.
I'm looking at you, Salesforce functions, but I guess we shouldn't poke too much around. And
Indeed. So let's jump into how did you solve these? Oh, sorry. Before I forget, this is a really fun thing. Because every time that we try to explain why governance is useful, and we'll definitely get back to this when we give some tips about how you can get started, is we face these common myths, right? People tell us, yeah, it just increases overhead, it will deter all our flexibility and innovation. Or they say, okay, this is the way that it has been described in whichever framework that they're pointing at. This is how we should do it. Or they think, yeah, it's just a one-time thing. We get to get our great minds together, and then we'll figure it out, and then we'll be good to go. And or it's they will say, because again, it's deterring flexibility. Innovation is just purely reactive. It will only fix. It will not be actually helping us. Or and these last two are really my favorite ones. They will kind of look at each other like, so governance, yeah, that's an IT thing, right? To make sure that your deployments are well done and you have the right quality gates. And then the other way around, we'll look at business like, yeah, okay, so this is a business thing, right? It's about you making sure you have the right priorities in mind and you have the right stakeholders and you have the right sign-offs. It's not. So it's none of, it's definitely not. It's a joint effort. It's something that you will evolve over time. So it's not a one-time project. It's not reactive. It really needs to be well set up, of course, to make sure that you can really leverage this to find the gains in your solutions that you're trying to set up. You have to tailor it, and we will get to that. And if you do it right, it should not increase the overhead. It will make sure that you don't have to do the same thing again and again, like we saw with Groundhog Day, or that you don't go so much down one of the rabbit holes to then discover that you really were kind of having a huge blind spot that you didn't catch, and now you have all this additional work to fix the technical debt. And isn't that the favorite thing we all love to do, fixing technical debt? So what is then an example of good governance? So we need to first think about what is a governing body. We already mentioned that it is a structure. And in this case, we're thinking about a governing body for Salesforce. So it will deal in this case for anything related to Salesforce. This will mean we need to include business and IT. As I mentioned, it's not one or the other, it's both. And we need to make sure that we unite them across the organization. Similar to the example that Christopher gave about, we noticed that the sales department wanted to start use Salesforce, or had started using Salesforce, but we already had the service department using Salesforce. Why were they not talking to each other? Why wasn't there a governing body that kind of overlooked all of this, brought these people together, and made sure that we could make the right decisions before we started investing tons of time and money? So some of the guiding questions that you can ask yourself to really think about, do we have a governing body? Do we have some governance? Is, for example, how are you dealing with work requests? Which means, how can users ask for a functionality or for features? How do those requests, these needs, requirements, how do they come in? And then once they are coming in, how are we deciding what matters, what should be more prioritized compared to other things, and who is making those decisions? And then this is definitely an important one that's not always looked at that well, is if we are thinking about, we want to bring this new feature into production, how will this go? Which steps are there? Who is involved in those steps? Who is signing off in each of those steps? And how are they structured? How are they from a tooling point of view, but also from a quality assurance and setting the right criteria point of view? How is this all set up? And who, again, needs to be involved? So, okay, let's follow this train of thought, right? We had a requirement come in, we prioritized this, we put it through all the necessary steps. Okay, great, it's in production, but we know that's not where it ends. There's some ownership that needs to be there. There will be things that go wrong on production. Either it's because of a misunderstanding between the users and the product owners, for example, on what it should do. Maybe training wasn't sufficient, or maybe it's really just a bug that we completely overlooked in any of the other steps. These things happen, and who is going to support that? So if you don't really have a clear answer on these elements, then it might be good to really consider, where do we need to start, tweak, and set up some governance?
So you might think about now how you're actually doing that. And we brought with us kind of some examples how we solve that for our customers. And the first thing is obviously a kind of a bottom-up solution. And for those who are actually here and potentially are aiming to go for the CTA, they know that kind of pyramid, or kind of like a similar solution around the kind of center of excellence. And that was one of those customers where we had a challenge that, as you saw before, as Lilith mentioned, hey, governance is like kind of overhead. We don't want to invest in that. It's just like, and we faced all the kind of moves there. So we tried to find a way to sneak it actually in, and we decided to go there for a kind of a community setup. You could call it also working streams. So the idea was like founding in the first something really at the bottom, at the working level, at the operational level, to get the kind of standardization going. So for this kind of customer, we went for some stuff related to campaign, because the customer is highly doing or highly investing in marketing. So we started there to find some alignments. Same for them for the lead. So it was quite close connected, and obviously the service. So if you ask yourself why this is maybe a little or looking a little bit bumpy, or maybe some parts are missing, it's really tailored down for that specific customer. And that's maybe also something important we didn't mention so far, but there's no one fits all solution. I mentioned the CTA as well. So if you're going for that, there's no one fits all solution, like a kind of a templateized approach, and you can take it and pick it up. Having something in mind is good, and having a structure also good, but you need to apply it for that specific customer. So in this case, we had the challenge with the governance overhead, and then we started like with the working stream. So it was an enterprise customer. So we brought people from all over the world together within one meeting. And as mentioned before, the idea is very, very simple. Bringing all stakeholders together. So taking the campaign stream. So what they figured out is actually, hey, we have like the same use cases. We have like the same ideas we want to bring live, and the potentially next things where we can add business value to it. So that was then the starting point where we could take over and assist in terms of, hey, okay, that are from a technical perspective, packaging, documentation, whatever, ways how you can then assist in terms of bringing standardization in and creating then some kind of value add. So the outcome is then pretty clear. Yeah, you have a shorter time to market. You can share knowledge across those working streams, and you have like a group, working stream, community, however you want to call it, where you can proactively sharing the knowledge. And that's also very important if you think about how Salesforce is still a quite new technology for some of those folks, for some of our customers, where they just need to learn and catch up with Salesforce, with the release cycle, with all the kind of new products. And if we're moving forward, then we have also like then the second example, and that was the way we've implemented it for the catalog I mentioned before. Yeah, the customer who just picked some Salesforce license and then started very isolated and within silos their Salesforce journey. So the basic idea what we've did there is like try to standardize the license management. So from a very, very technical point, we started in terms of what kind of licenses we actually using within that kind of enterprise organization. And then we created a Salesforce instance to manage that from a central perspective. And the idea or the outcome is really like, we have a dedicated team which can then assist, kind of a COE-like. We have a dedicated team which can then assist within procuring new licenses, and again, bringing the right people together. So you see, bringing the right people together is like one of those key elements again. So if a new project was kicking off, then they looked first, okay, they want to use taking something new now, Data Cloud, for example. Then they can bring together this project initiative, this business unit together with some other units as well, where they can share their thoughts, ideas, insights, some kind of limitations, just creating a platform for sharing knowledge. And maybe last but not least, then in a kind of a third place, or third idea, Lily, do you want to add something?
Sorry, yeah, always. It's I've already been quite long, you know me. No, so I think this is really a very, very good example of how can you really get this bottom up going, because one is, if we look at the myths again, right? A lot of people are a bit scared about governance because they think it's going to cost money and create overhead, and what's in it for them. why should they do it? What is the immediate advantage that they will have? And here this was so clear. So this is such a good example, Christopher, in that way, that what is the immediate, what's in it for them is that maybe they can start grouping licenses, leveraging their licenses in a more efficient manner, and therefore cut costs where possible, and actually create new budgets to do really new and exciting things, like maybe a data cloud. So starting from a very, very clear gain that the stakeholders can have is incredibly useful in making sure that we get this incentive and this motivation with the right people going, to make sure that they are eager to really be a part of this. And then once the spark is lit, let's say, it's easier to extend this group of people and bring in new elements that we want to collaborate on, like new initiatives like you mentioned, but also maybe some other elements that we see, maybe these are also some common concerns that we can think of and that we can work with. So I think this is definitely one of my favorite examples. Sorry to interrupt you.
All good. Last one, maybe. Third example. And that's something we brought in for the Groundhog Day. That's the kind of solution. So thinking of like creating a kind of an architecture board where you found or taking the decisions which are needed and fit for that specific purpose. So breaking it down for the integration, Salesforce is providing various different integration patterns and obviously even like tools as a kind of integration layer. So MuleSoft, for example. And you can think about having some of those patterns, having them first in mind, and creating some kind of guidelines when to use what, based on obviously, where those kind of integrations patterns fit based on the how they actually design. This one would or immediately removed a lot of complexity within that kind of Groundhog Day example. Why? Because we didn't have to talk about again and again, hey, okay, do we need the data in real time, near real time? What are potentially trade-offs? We had like a dedicated instance with the architecture board in place, where we avoided to have like a very, very large group in terms of like tons of stakeholders who brought in potentially a lot of expertise, but also a lot of distraction. So the idea was like, okay, we take now this use case, bring it for an architecture board where you have like the real stakeholders, the real SMEs, and then taking the decision based on the Salesforce framework, and then take the decision based on that. So we created then a kind of a governance structure met every or twice a week actually, where all other kind of working streams, project members can bring up like a dedicated challenge they have in terms of the implementation or where they're kind of seeking for advice, and bring it for a dedicated board. And there the decision is made. The good thing is we have all stakeholders which are necessary for the project always available within that kind of meeting. So we avoided like, hey, okay, we need to have Paul in that, we need to have XYZ, and so on and so on. And second benefit of that is, as you see it in the slide, we try to bring the standardization level there also quite to kind of a high amount, yeah, so that you avoid to have a lot of isolated solutions for a particular increment you want to actually deliver. You have really like dedicated patterns you can leverage, and we leverage them all the time, which is reducing the complexity, and we stick so way closer to the Salesforce standard and avoid with that also like those kind of unicorn solutions where we potentially build up a lot of technical debt.
Yeah, and I really also like the fact that with this approach and with something like a architecture board, design authority, whatever flavor you want to put out there, I think it's just so incredibly useful to make sure that you kind of create a kind of helicopter overview of what is all happening, what are some of the challenges. And it really helps you also make sure that you are reusing certain best practices or new patterns that you have set up previously. And it really also helps with indeed that standardization and sometimes pushing back on why do we really need that localization, especially if you already have some examples that you can point to on where it was able to be slightly cut, the localization, or in a very clear way abstracted. And that will help you again in making sure that your overall solution in the end is easier to maintain afterwards, is easier to extend afterwards. Yeah, I cannot tout this enough. So
You can continue.
yeah, well, if PowerPoint is okay, yes, sorry. Technical glitch. So I really think it's a bit daunting, especially if you look at some of the frameworks out there, or if you just think about all the things that you need to keep in mind when you want to set up governance, that we give you a few pieces of advice that you can take away, that you can start looking at. And we boiled it down into three main things. So the first one is really to identify the culture. As we mentioned, there is no one size fits all. And if you kind of can identify the culture that your company has, you can use, for example, the SOGAF, which we will talk a bit about later. It's just the operating model, for example, of your organization. It can really help you see which things may help or may fit, which things would never fly. And that is really important to make sure that you're not setting something up that will fail in the end. Because again, you cannot just take a template, paste it on somewhere else, and make sure or hope that it works there. It needs to be intentional, as we started. And then starting small, I think the example that Chris gave with the license management is one of the best ones there, where you have a very clear goal, you work towards that, you're not overburdening your organization immediately. You have this very low hanging fruit that you're delivering. It's a very quick and first win. And because of that first increment that you've done, you can really iterate on it and add a bit more to it wherever you see the value. So it
Maybe
doesn't,
to add
yeah.
here, before I forget it, we always start with like in an agile way with like those kind of small, tiny increments where we really want to pushing forward and really delivering the first increments. And for governance, we always think about like the huge kind of solution with like everything in place and tons of kind of persons, expertise, to dos. Don't do that. Starting here also small is like kind of a key. Finding the right balance, what you actually need, and try to solve it.
Yeah, exactly. And again, coming to the last part, what is your utopia? What are you really going for? What are the current pain points that you have? And then where do you want to go in the future? So to some extent, you of course need to have a rough idea, but that's going back to the culture on where could you possibly end up. But this isn't carved in stone. And let's start with what is currently being the most disruptive, let's say, in your organization. Like, for example, the example that Christopher gave about the architecture board. Maybe that's exactly it, is that people are really just solutioning in silos next to each other. There's no conversation, there's no best practices that are being leveraged throughout the organization. Well, then that's a very clear usually more of an IT concern, right? Or it could be we are spending all this money on licenses, but where is it going? Are we really making the best use of it? Then the license example is maybe the small starting point that could help there. So I'm not gonna go too deep into this one. There's a ton of really, really good resources on this. So it's just a bit about when we talk about the culture of a organization, these are a few things that you can keep in mind when you're trying to quickly assess what kind of organization do we have in mind. And again, it's not black and white, it's just to give you a bit of some handles to make it easier to assess what will work, what won't work, or how do you need to tackle certain things. So first of all, if you look at the first axis, the vertical one, we see that we have business process integration. So this is to what extent do we have the same data? Sorry, oh, okay. To what extent do we have the same process? Sorry, across. I'm mixing them up. To what extent do we have the same data? See, I also get these confused sometimes across the organization, right? Is to what extent do we have that? So you can have the low or the high, and then depending on where it falls on the business process standardization, you will see which kind of different processes do we have. So we might have the data that needs to be shared across the BUs, or we might have data that is not shared across the BUs, but the processes are the same. So these are things that will help you identify, are we more of a coordination where we have very, very, very unique BUs, but there is shared data that we need to make sure that is being shared across these different BUs. Well, then we need to really think about, okay, we at least need to get them together when it comes to the data. Even if we know that there's some quite big regional discrepancies when it comes to the processes, on the data, we need to make sure that they're aligned and that we think really hard about the data lifecycle and also maybe about where everything is flowing and why. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but that was just one example. You can go into one extreme where there's nothing shared, no process, no data, nothing, or where everything is shared. Well, this will give you an indication if everything is shared, then we need to really make sure that indeed we have very good alignment between everyone, because for sure there will be quick wins to be made across these different needs and requirements that we see there. So just to give you a bit of an idea. Okay, so this was probably
Finally,
a bit
it's
much.
time for bad jokes again, yeah.
Yeah, it's time for bad jokes again. So, whoa, this is heavy, but if you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything. That is us very, very badly quoting Marty McFly. So I know it's a lot to take in, but as we mentioned, you don't have to do everything immediately. It doesn't all have to make sense immediately. You just take a very small thing where you feel like there's a benefit there, and then the biggest step that you can take is just getting started. And I think with that, Christopher, we covered pretty much what we wanted to cover. And we might have some time for questions.
Indeed. Feel free to ask. So there was a first question already. Potentially I picked that up. I tried to answer it already. So there was a question in terms of like the timeline, and that's a kind of a good one. So as mentioned with Lilith, start small is like the kind of key element here. So taking the example with like the working streams, you need to, nothing happens kind of overnight. You need to have some time to get the consistency in, to identify really kind of all stakeholders. And in forehand, you need to think about and spending some time in analyzing. So what Lilith showed with like the different kind of operation model is like, if you're going one step backwards, it's, you're asking yourself the question, what kind of organization I'm in, or for which kind of organization I'm currently working, getting the kind of understanding and then finding there or getting and feeling how the company, the organization is behaving, how they are doing. You need to spend some time to analyze it, and then first, in the first place, then secondly, finding then the appropriate solution for that. And then for that appropriate solution, you need to add some kind of time in your mind to get the consistency going. It doesn't help to get started with like, okay, let's found a working stream and just meet once, and then we see how things are going from there. Try to bring in some kind of cascadence, and keeping it also in mind that most likely the persons who are actually joining that particular working stream, they can't work for 100% for that particular stream. So they are not hired potentially exactly for this exercise. So thinking or keeping that in mind that you need to add that or they need to add that to their schedule and also to their own prioritization list. So long story short, that will result in that you potentially meet on those working streams and potentially just on a 2 or 3 weekly basis, but nevertheless you have the starting point, and then you realize after the third, fourth meeting that you will see already like positive outcomes.
Yeah, indeed. And I think it also touches on another comment that I saw about how can you identify the right stakeholders to drive your initiatives. And they put in an analogy which I really like, is if you don't have the right stakeholders, it can be like running on a bicycle with stands on. Uh, so yeah, you don't want that, of course. And to be fair, I think this is not always easy. I think you're always going to have stakeholders that are very eager to be a part of it, to really get going and help set things up, but they might not be the decision makers, which means that you can do certain efforts and you can set certain things up to a certain extent, but it will come down to sometimes even the Groundhog Day example, where because there's no decision maker in the room, everyone has good intentions, is motivated, really wants to get a solution out, but because the decision maker is not there at the right table, involved in the right meeting, then yeah, you're not getting anywhere either. So this is something that you need to really make sure that you keep the goal. Sometimes again, we love to get lost in discussions about solutions, but we need to keep the goal in mind about, what is it we want to achieve, and we want to achieve basically decisions being made so we can move ahead, right? Whether it's a business decision, solution decision, organizational decision, doesn't matter. That's what we want to get out of this. So if we feel like that is not happening, we need to reassess and see, do we have the right people? Maybe not. Let's find the right people.
There's a great question in terms of, and I try to summarize it, correct me if I didn't get it wrong, how to bring in and presenting kind of like the right governance solution, I would say, to mitigate the risk across different business units, as well as functional or to bring in and working with functional and regional compliance. That is the question. So I take it around and flip it in that way. For example, within Europe, you have like very strong GDPR regulations. So if you're doing a project there, you need to involve potentially legal, data compliance, office, however it's called in that specific organization quite early. To do so, and if you're working quite internationally, you will face also like other regional challenges like data residency requirements, the California Data Act, where you have also like certain things to consider. And my proposal here would be found a working stream for that. The working stream would be called potential legal or compliance. And from a COE, which sits on top, you have like business as well as the IT, which bring in then consistently their prioritization and their roadmap. We didn't talk about too much today about those topics, but you need to involve them quite early stage, because then you can realize very fast which kind of potentially issues you have in terms of compliance and data residency requirements and so on and so on, even like things like workers' council. So identifying those kind of risks quite early will help you to find the right way to mitigate them. So my answer would be found a working stream for that. Bring in the legal department so that they are up to speed quite early in your development process.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is key in what you're saying here, and of course that's exactly what you are pointing towards, it doesn't have to be, or I wouldn't advise even, to really bring too many stakeholders with different kind of goals and hats um, together in one room, because then again we'll have the herd mentality, or we'll have side conversations that might not be relevant in this case. We're talking on the one hand about compliance, which I really like the answer that Christopher already gave, right? Bring those together, create a work stream for that, and set those also somewhere in your process that there should be a review by compliance to make sure that we haven't missed anything. Because of course, if you know that there's a risk, you involve them proactively, but we need to also have a fail-safe mechanism, let's say. But the other part there was there's also a functional group, right, across the BUs, and there might be some similar streams. And this is the example. Well, it's just one example, of course, but the first one that you gave, Christopher, with the communities, there we saw some functional streams, basically, right? And that's how they could be organized as well.
There's another question quite related to road mapping and the licensing example we've provided. So the question is, potentially you need kind of a bunch of Salesforce licenses and different products. And what is like the best way and the advice to deal with it if you have such a structure in place, like a kind of a COE which is taking care for the license management? And the answer would be then, and sorry for the consultancy answer, it depends. It really depends on like the company contract with Salesforce, and I can't go into too much detail because it's like normally between the Salesforce and that particular company, which needs to deal with it. But thinking it from a prioritization standpoint and potentially from a roadmap point of view, obviously you need to find the right way how you implement things. And that license team, which is taking care, can assist here because they have the understanding and the knowledge after a while how long projects are typically running. So if you're taking the example, quite simple. You want to start first with a sales and service cloud implementation, you procure the respective licenses, everything around there, and then you want to reach like the next maturity level. So let's say in terms of service, like a service cloud voice implementation, maybe you start with just one channel and then you want to go to an omni-channel approach. That dedicated team can then help to find the right time to procure potentially those licenses and or help in terms of bringing the right knowledge to that dedicated project so that you know, okay, it doesn't make sense to do the kind of big bang and we procure everything, but bringing it on the right roadmap, bringing in the right prioritization, that would be then the part and yeah, the exercise where that team can assist those different kind of BUs and projects.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think I would also add again, if you look at some of the things that we discussed today, elements that will play a role in this one is, for example, of course the planning, but where is your planning based on? For example, is everyone going to be using these products in the same way with the same data? I'm going again to the operating models because that will have an impact on how you would probably phase your implementation plan, your rollout plan, and that will then again in turn influence what license use you will need at which point. Again, is it with a pilot group? Are we fully moving with the complete department there? Maybe there's a B2B and a B2C department, and we're only moving one of them first. There's a lot of things to really consider, and it boils down to knowing exactly what you want to do. And with exactly, I don't mean, again, it needs to be written in stone, but you need to have a very clear view on the impacts that your decisions will have. For example, we probably don't want a big bang, is what Christopher said, and usually we don't, because that's a lot of change to manage. That's a lot of people to help, support, train, get going, potential support issues, or maybe missed elements in training that will pop up after go live. You don't want to paralyze your complete organization. You want to make sure that there's, very stable rollout. Again, it could depend on the particular thing that you're rolling out, the group of people, the urgency, criticality. There's a lot of things that play a part in this. But the most important thing to keep in mind here is what are you really targeting here and how does it fit in your organization? All right. One more question. What are the key performance indicators or metrics that organizations can track to measure the success of implemented governance framework in Salesforce? That's an interesting one. And actually, we talked about this when we told you some of the advice. What is your utopia? What do you want to achieve? and that will define the key performance indicators that you want to set. I know we're such consultants, Christopher. We're gonna say
Yeah. That was a kind of the sneak out answer. But maybe to formulate it in that way, governance, and that's potentially again a consultancy answer. The success of governance is maybe if you just have like running a really good project, to keep it simple. That would be like the very simple answer. Meaning, you potentially have everything in place, all stakeholders. You reached with your Salesforce implementation a quite high maturity level. You have like we talked a lot about technical debt already. You have like a very short list of technical debt, for example. That are kind of a few things you can consider as a kind of elements of good governance, or even take it simpler in terms of code quality. Yeah, if you have a very high code quality, if you have very good testing framework, if you have no issues in terms of deployments, all those like that, all things like that, but also not maybe those purely technical things, also from a business value. If you're realizing that the return of invest you get out of your Salesforce implementation is quite high, that can be an element as well. So understand governance as a kind of a supporting structure to reach those kind of KPIs. Most likely, if a Salesforce implementation fail, or if you don't reach those kind of KPIs, you potentially have certain elements in your governance structure which are not ideal or ideal for that specific solution you're aiming for.
Yeah, and one of the other things that could be, again, depending on what your goal was, maybe your goal is because you're gonna have a lot of in flight, you have a lot of people coming and going in your organization, or maybe a lot of reskilling happening. How long does it take to onboard them? It can give you an indication of how good your documentation is, to what extent they need to really think about, I need to dive in, I don't know what this field is for. That's just an easy example. How long does it take to onboard them, or how much is your solution being adopted? Going back to the ROI example that Christopher gave, these are very, very key elements to keep in mind. Yeah, and data quality and integrity is also a good one, but that's, again, you need to define the parameters for that as well, and it depends on which elements do you value. Is it about how accessible, easy to retrieve your data is? Maybe how well you're equipped for recovery if something goes wrong? Or maybe it's really about how much you can use it for your analytics, how well it is filled in, how much is the percentage of empty fields, those kind of things, doing a field trip check on those things. It can be quite broad what your KPIs can be, depending on the goal that you have. For example, maybe Christopher, that might be easier to explain. The license management example, the clear goal there was get a better view of where we are spending our money, right? And making sure that we are spending it on the right kind of licenses, and we are getting the most out of those licenses. That is a very clear KPI of cost cutting and reducing the total TCO. All right. I think that was the last question. The recording, yes, it will be on the channel, the Apex Hours channel on YouTube.
Keep in
You
mind to
should
subscribe it. We got the memo.
Amit is so proud.
Hopefully.
Thank you, Lalit, and thank you, Christopher, for such a great presentation. Lots of information. I hope that will be helpful for our audience. Now, if you like this presentation, I will be highly recommended. Go on social media, spread your love for our speaker who is spending their time free of cost for you. So, if you like this, go ahead and share your love on the social media for our speaker.
Yeah,
Thank you,
and
everyone,
thank
for
you.
joining. Thank you, Lalit. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. And thanks for the great participation and questions. Have a good day.